Tonight, before you try to fall asleep, before the noise of this world returns tomorrow, just breathe for a moment. Slow down. You do not need to carry everything right now. Maybe today exhausted you more than anyone realizes. Maybe you smiled in front of people, while quietly falling apart inside. Maybe your mind has been racing for weeks. Too many thoughts, too many fears, too many things you cannot control, and somewhere deep inside you are tired. Tired of overthinking, tired of pretending. But tonight, tired, I want you to know something. Jesus sees the part of you that nobody else sees. The hidden pain, the silent anxiety, the pressure you never talk about. He sees it all. And he is not turning away from you. So tonight, do not listen to the voice of fear. Do not listen to the voice that says you are too broken, too far gone, or too lost to be loved. Because the voice of Jesus sounds different. His voice is gentle. His voice brings peace. His voice speaks to the weary soul. And perhaps that is why you are here tonight. Not by accident, not by coincidence, but because your soul has been longing for rest. The kind of rest this world cannot give. The kind of peace that survives even in darkness. So wherever you are listening from, tonight, whether your heart feels heavy, whether your mind feels restless, whether you feel close to God or very far away, stay here for a little while. Let the noise fade. Let the pressure fade. Let the fear slowly loosen its grip. Tonight is not about religion. It is not about performance. It is not about pretending to have everything together. Tonight is simply about being with Jesus, the one who still walks toward exhausted people, the one who still comforts the anxious, the one who still sits beside the lonely. And as you listen tonight, do not rush. There is nothing you need to prove here. Just breathe slowly and listen carefully. Because some of these words may reach the exact place in your heart that has been hurting for a very long time. So close your eyes if you want to. Relax your shoulders. Quiet your thoughts. And let the voice of Jesus speak peace over your soul tonight. There are some battles that nobody sees. The kind that happen quietly, deep inside the mind, deep inside the heart. And sometimes, those are the hardest battles of all, because from the outside, everything may look normal. You still go to work, you still answer messages, you still smile when people expect you to smile. But inside, something feels heavy. Some people listening tonight have been carrying pressure for so long. They no longer remember what peace feels like. The pressure to survive, the pressure to stay strong, the pressure to hold everything together, even while falling apart emotionally. And maybe you have become so used to carrying pain that you no longer talk about it anymore. You just keep moving. You quietly, slowly, trying to survive another day. But Jesus never ignored weary people. He noticed the exhausted. He moved toward the broken, toward the anxious, toward the forgotten, toward the ones who felt spiritually empty. And perhaps tonight, he is moving toward you too, not because you have everything figured out, not because your faith is perfect, not because you always make the right choices, but because he sees your heart. He sees how tired you really are. He sees the nights you cannot sleep, the thoughts that keep circling in your mind, the memories you wish you could erase, the fears you never say out loud. And still, he stays close. Some people have been pretending to be okay for a very long time. Pretending the anxiety is manageable. Pretending the loneliness does not hurt. Pretending the sadness will eventually disappear on its own. But exhaustion has a way of slowly reaching the soul, little by little, until even small things begin to feel heavy. And maybe tonight you arrived here, carrying invisible weight. Weight from disappointment. Weight from heartbreak. Weight from fear about the future. Weight from mistakes you still regret. Some people carry guilt for years. Quiet guilt. Private guilt. The kind nobody knows about. And over time, that guilt becomes a voice. A voice that whispers, "You are too broken. You are too far gone." God must be disappointed in you. But the voice of Jesus has never sounded like shame. Never. When Jesus met wounded people, he did not crush them. He restored them. When he met the Samaritan woman, he already knew her story. He knew her pain, her broken relationships, her loneliness, her hidden shame, and still, he spoke to her with compassion. When fear took over him, when he denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus still came back for him, still loved him, still restored him. Because Jesus does not walk away from imperfect people. If he did, none of us would have hope. And maybe somebody listening tonight desperately needed to hear that. You do not need to earn the love of Jesus. You do not need to perform for him. You do not need to pretend to be stronger than you are. You can come tired. You can come anxious. You can come uncertain. You can come carrying questions, because Jesus has always welcomed weary souls. That is why his words still comfort people thousands of years later, because they speak directly to human pain, to fear, to loneliness, to hearts searching for peace. And perhaps that is exactly what your soul has been searching for lately. Will you see? Peace. Not temporary distraction, not noise, not escape. Real peace. The kind that remains even when life feels uncertain. The kind that holds you together when everything around you feels unstable. The world offers temporary comfort, temporary distractions. The fear returns. But eventually, the noise returns. The fear returns. The emptiness. And that is why so many people feel emotionally exhausted. Because nothing in this world can fully carry the weight of the human soul. Not success, not money, not relationships, not achievements, not even constant busyness. Eventually, the soul still longs for something deeper, something eternal. And this is why the words of Jesus feel different. His words do not simply inform the mind, and they calm the soul. They reach the hidden places inside people, the places nobody else can see. Maybe that is why millions of exhausted people throughout history have found themselves crying while hearing the words of Christ, because something inside them recognizes truth, recognizes hope, recognizes love, even in weakness, even in failure, even in fear. And tonight, you do not have to carry everything alone anymore. Not for the next few hours. Not in this moment. Just breathe slowly. Let your thoughts settle little by little. There is no rush here. No pressure. No performance. Only the quiet invitation of Jesus. The same invitation he has spoken for generations. Come to me. Not when you are perfect. Not when you finally fix your life. Not when you become strong enough. Come now. Come weary. Come burdened. Come exhausted. Come anxious. Come exactly as you are, because the heart of Jesus has always been drawn toward struggling people, toward fearful people, toward people who feel spiritually tired, and toward people who feel saturally tired. That invitation is for you too. Maybe your soul has been fighting battles nobody understands. Maybe you feel emotionally drained from carrying responsibilities. Maybe your mind has become a storm of constant thoughts. Maybe you feel distant from God. Or maybe you simply feel tired of being tired. If that is you, stay here tonight. Do not rush away. Let these words slow your breathing. Let them quiet the noise inside your mind. And for the next little while, allow yourself to rest, not in the promises of the world, but in the presence of Jesus, the one who still heals weary hearts, the one who still restores broken souls, the one who still brings peace into anxious minds. And listen carefully, because some of the words you are about to hear, may become the very words that carry you through the darkness you have been facing. It was the hottest part of the day, the kind of heat that makes the air feel heavy. Most people came to the well much earlier, in the cool of the morning, together. But she came alone, quietly, avoiding the eyes of other people, avoiding the whispers, the judgment, the shame she had learned to live with. Day after day, maybe she had once hoped life would turn out differently, to ask if the one had come. Maybe she once believed she would finally be loved, finally be accepted, finally feel safe somewhere. But disappointment has a way of changing people, especially repeated disappointment. And at a special time, she became that leaves scars no one can see. And over time, she became the kind of person others talked about. The kind of person society quietly pushed to the side. The kind the So, the kind of person people judged, without ever understanding her pain. And perhaps tonight, some people listening understand exactly how that feels. To feel misunderstood. To feel labeled by your mistakes. To feel like people only see your failures and never your wounds. The woman slowly approached the well, carrying the only thing, jar. But truthfully, the jar was not the only thing empty in her life. And then she saw him, Jesus, waiting there beside the well, not avoiding her, not condemning her, not turning away from her, waiting. And sometimes that is how Jesus enters a person's life, quietly, unexpectedly, not during moments of strength, but during moments of exhaustion, moments when the soul is tired, moments when people feel emotionally empty. Jesus looked at her and said, "Will you give me a drink?" Such simple words. And yet, everything began to change from that moment. Because Jesus crossed boundaries nobody else would cross. A Jewish man speaking openly to a Samaritan woman shocked people in that culture. But Jesus was never controlled by human prejudice. He saw beyond labels, beyond reputation, beyond shame. He saw the soul standing in front of him. And maybe tonight you need to remember that too. Jesus sees beyond the image people have of you, beyond your past, beyond your failures, beyond the parts of yourself you try to hide. He sees the deeper story, the pain beneath the silence, the loneliness beneath the smile, the fear beneath the strong appearance. And still, he stays close. The woman looked confused, suspicious, guarded. People who have been hurt for a long time often become guarded. They stop expecting kindness. They stop expecting understanding sometimes. They even stop believing they deserve love anymore. She asked him why he would speak to her. And Jesus answered, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Living water. Not temporary comfort, not temporary relief. Something deeper, something eternal. Because the human soul becomes thirsty. People try everything. Success, relationships, pleasure, relationships, achievement, constant noise, and still. Many go to sleep feeling empty inside, because nothing temporary can fully heal an eternal soul. Only God can reach that deep. Only His presence can satisfy the deepest thirst inside the human heart. But the woman still did not. Speaking did not fully understand like Fikipul, she thought. Jesus was only speaking about physical things, about water, about thirst, about the well. But Jesus was speaking about the soul, about the deep thirst inside people that no human achievement can remove. And perhaps tonight, many people listening know exactly what that thirst feels like. The thirst for peace, the thirst for purpose, the thirst to finally feel emotionally safe, the thirst to know that your life matters. Jesus told her, "Everyone who drinks this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst." What incredible words! Because Jesus understood something humanity still struggles to understand today. Nothing in this world can permanently satisfy the soul. Not money, not approval, not constant entertainment. Not endless success. Eventually, the emptiness returns, the anxiety returns, the loneliness returns. And that is why so many people feel exhausted, because they keep searching for eternal peace in temporary places. But Jesus offered something completely different. Living water, peace that does not disappear overnight, hope stronger than fear, love stronger than shame. Rest deeper, then sleep, and slowly the woman's heart began to open. For perhaps the first time in a long time, someone was speaking to her soul instead of condemning her past. But then Jesus said something unexpected, something deeply personal. Go, call your husband. And because Jesus gently touched the wound she spent years hiding, she answered quietly, "I have no husband." And Jesus responded with compassion and truth. Together, you are right. You have had 5 husbands, and the man you are with now is not your husband. Imagine that moment. The silence, the shock, the realization that Jesus saw everything. Everything she tried to bury. Everything. She hoped nobody would notice. And yet, he was still speaking to her with kindness. Not cruelty, not humiliation. Kindness, because Jesus reveals wounds to heal them, not to destroy people with shame. Some people listening tonight carry hidden wounds too. Things nobody regrets. Private pain, private failures, and sometimes the fear of being fully known becomes terrifying because people assume if others knew the real me, they would walk away. But Jesus already sees everything, and he still moves toward broken people, still calls them closer, still offers grace. That is what makes the love of Christ so different from human love. Human love often depends on performance, appearance, success, usefulness, appearance. But the love of Jesus reaches people even in their worst moments, even in shame, even in failure, even in spiritual exhaustion. The woman began to realize she was standing before someone extraordinary, someone holy, someone who somehow saw directly into the hidden places of the human heart. She said, "Sir, I can see that you are a prophet." But Jesus was far more than a prophet. He was the Savior, standing beside a broken soul. And perhaps he is standing beside some broken souls tonight too. People who feel forgotten, people carrying emotional exhaustion, people silently battling fear, people still trying to hold themselves together. Jesus continued speaking about worship, about truth, about the Father seeking worshippers who worship in spirit and truth. Because God was never looking for perfect performances. For Saintsky, he was always looking for honest hearts, honest surrender, real relationship. And finally, the woman spoke about the coming Messiah, the one who would explain everything. And then Jesus said words that changed her life forever. I, the one speaking to you, am He. Imagine hearing those words, the realization. Imagine the overwhelming emotion. The real Saichu had chosen to speak directly to her, not to the religious elite, not to powerful leaders, but to a wounded woman sitting beside a well. Because Jesus has always moved toward the broken, toward people society overlooks, toward weary souls searching for hope. And suddenly, the shame that once defined her no longer controlled her. The fear, loneliness no longer controlled her. The loneliness no longer controlled her. Because one encounter with Jesus can begin changing a soul forever. The woman left her water jar behind. She ran back into the town, the same town she once tried to avoid. And now she was telling people, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did, and still loved me enough to stay, and perhaps tonight." That is the message some hearts desperately needed to hear. Jesus already knows everything about you. Every fear, every mistake, every hidden scar, every silent battle. And still, His love remains. Still passionate, still reaching toward weary souls. So, if you feel broken tonight, do not run from Him. Come closer. Because Jesus has never been afraid of wounded people, and He is not afraid of your story either. There are nights when anxiety feels louder than everything else, louder than reason, louder than hope, louder than faith itself. And sometimes the mind becomes exhausted from fighting thoughts that never seem to stop. Thoughts about tomorrow, thoughts about money, about family, about mistakes, about uncertainty, about all the things you cannot control. And the difficult part about anxiety is that many battles happen silently. Nobody sees the overthinking. Nobody hears the conversations happening inside your mind at 2 in the morning. Nobody notices how tired your soul becomes from carrying invisible, understands anxious hearts completely. He understands what fear does to people, how it steals peace, how it drains joy, how it slowly convinces people to live in survival mode instead of trust. That is why Jesus spoke so often about fear, because He knew humanity would struggle with it deeply. And perhaps some people listening tonight are struggling with it right now. Maybe your future feels uncertain. Maybe you feel pressure you cannot escape. Maybe your mind feels constantly restless, or maybe you are simply tired of worrying all the time. Worry is exhausting. It drains emotional strength little by little. It fills the mind with endless what-ifs. What if things never get better? What if everything falls apart? What if I fail? What if I lose the people I love? What if I cannot handle? What if I cannot handle what is coming? And eventually, fear begins creating storms inside the mind. Storms that follow people everywhere, even into quiet moments, even into prayer, even into sleep. But one of the most beautiful things about Jesus is that he speaks peace directly into storms. Not after the storm disappears, during it. There was a moment when the disciples found themselves trapped in violent winds while crossing the sea. Nos, the storm grew stronger. The waves crashed harder. The boat shook beneath them, and experienced fishermen became terrified. Fear has a way of making people feel powerless. Even strong people, even faithful people. And perhaps tonight, some people feel like their lives resemble that storm. Everything feels unstable. Everything feels uncertain. And deep down, fear keeps whispering that you are about to sink. But while the disciples panicked, Jesus remained calm, not because the storm was small, but because his authority was greater than the storm itself. And eventually he stood and spoke words that still calm anxious hearts today. Peace, be still. Imagine that moment, the wind stopping, the waves calming, the sudden silence after chaos. Because peace enters differently when Jesus speaks. And maybe tonight, your soul is longing for that same peace. Not shallow positivity, not temporary that steadies. The heart in difficult seasons, real peace. The kind that reminds fearful people. The kind looked at Jesus in amazement. The disciples looked at Jesus in amazement because they realized something important. Even the storm obeyed him. Even chaos obeyed him. And if Jesus could calm storms on the sea, he can calm storms inside the human heart too. Some people listening tonight have lived with anxiety for so long. They no longer remember what inner calm feels like. The mind becomes restless, always preparing for disaster, always expecting bad news, always carrying tension, and slowly, people begin losing the ability to rest. But Jesus never invited people into a life ruled by fear. He invited them into trust, not perfect understanding. Trust is difficult sometimes, especially when life feels uncertain, especially when prayers seem unclear, especially when the future feels. But Jesus understood the weakness of anxious hearts. That is why he once said, "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself." What gentle wisdom! Because anxiety constantly drags people into futures they cannot control. It steals today's peace by creating tomorrow's fear. And many people spend years emotionally exhausted, fighting imaginary disasters that never even happen. Jesus continued by pointing people toward the birds of the air, the flowers of the field, simple things creation already understood. The flowers do not obsess over tomorrow. And yet, God faithfully takes care of them. And yet, God faithfully take care for you. Sometimes, anxious people forget their value to God. They begin believing they are alone, forgotten, unseen. But Jesus reminds weary souls that the Father sees them completely. Every fear, every burden, every silent prayer whispered through tears, nothing escapes his attention. And perhaps tonight, you need to hear this clearly. Your anxiety does not scare God. Your fear does not push him away. Your exhausted mind does not make him abandon you. He remains patient even with anxious hearts, because he knows how fragile human beings can become. Jesus once said, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you." These words were never meant to create pressure. They were meant to create hope, even when the heart coming back to God, even when the heart feels weak, even when faith feels small, even when fear feels overwhelming. Some people stop praying because they feel too exhausted, too disappointed, too emotionally numb. But Jesus never told weary people to stay away. He welcomed them closer, again and again. And maybe tonight, your soul simply needs permission to rest in his presence. Not striving, not pretending. Just resting. Because exhausted minds desperately need stillness. The world trains people to constantly rush, constantly consume noise, constantly chase productivity. But the soul was never designed to live without rest. That is why so many people feel emotionally overwhelmed. Their minds never stop running. Their hearts never slow down. Their spirits never breathe. And eventually, the anxiety becomes unbearable. But Jesus offers something different from the world. Stillness, safety. Rest not because life suddenly becomes perfect, but because his presence changes how people walk through difficult seasons. There is something deeply healing about realizing you do not have to carry every burden alone. You do not have to control every outcome. You do not have to solve every future problem tonight. Sometimes, the soul simply needs to surrender to breathe, to let go of the illusion of control. Because many anxious people secretly believe, if I worry enough, maybe I can prevent pain. But worry has never protected. The human heart is gently inviting some people tonight. And perhaps Jesus is gently some people tonight to release burdens they were never meant to carry alone, to release the pressure, the panic, the constant fear. Not all at once, but little by little, breath by breath, moment by moment, because healing often begins slowly, quietly, like the calming of waves after a storm, and maybe right now. Jesus is speaking softly into the chaos inside your mind. Not with condemnation, not with anger, but with peace. The kind of peace anxious hearts desperately search for. The kind of peace that reminds you you are not abandoned. You are not forgotten. You are not fighting alone. Even here, even tonight, even in the middle of fear, Jesus remains near to weary souls, near to trembling hearts, near to anxious minds struggling to rest. So, if your thoughts feel heavy tonight, slow your breathing. Release the pressure little by little. You do not need to solve tomorrow right now. You only need to rest in the presence of God for this moment. And perhaps that moment of surrender may become the beginning of peace, returning to your soul. There comes a point when exhaustion reaches deeper than the body, deeper than physical tiredness, deeper than physical tiredness, deeper than sleep deprivation. It reaches the soul, and soul exhaustion feels different. It is the kind of weariness that follows people everywhere, the kind that remains, even after resting, even after vacations, even after moments that were supposed to help, because some forms of tiredness are not physical at all. They are emotional, spiritual, mental, and perhaps tonight, someone listening feels exactly like that. Not simply tired, but deeply weary inside. Weary from carrying responsibilities. Weary from fighting silent battles. Nobody understands. Weary from constantly to stay strong. Weary from constantly trying to stay strong. Sometimes people become so emotionally exhausted. They stop recognizing themselves. Their joy fades. Their motivation fades. Even simple tasks begin feeling heavy, and quietly, they begin surviving instead of truly living. But Jesus understood weary souls completely. That is why some of his most comforting words were spoken to exhausted people, not perfect people. Not perfect people, as not powerful people, exhausted people. He once said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." What beautiful words. Not pressure, not condemnation, rest. And maybe that invitation feels especially personal tonight, because many people have spent years carrying burdens they were never meant to carry alone. The burden of fear, the burden of guilt, the burden of trying to please everyone, the burden of pretending to be okay, the burden of holding families together while quietly falling apart inside. Some people are emotionally exhausted from being strong for everyone else, always helping, always supporting, always listening, always carrying other people's pain. And eventually, their own soul begins breaking under the weight. But Jesus never asked people to destroy themselves, trying to hold everything together. He invited them into rest, real rest, the kind the world cannot manufacture, the kind that reaches the deepest parts of the human heart. There was a moment when Jesus visited the home of two sisters, Mary and Martha. Martha worked tirelessly, preparing everything, moving constantly, serving constantly, trying to make everything perfect. But Mary sat quietly near Jesus, listening, resting in his presence, and eventually Martha became frustrated, overwhelmed, emotionally drained. She asked, "Jesus, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work alone?" How human that moment feels. How many people listening tonight secretly feel the same way, carrying responsibilities alone, feeling unsupported, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, feeling like nobody notices how much pressure they are under. But Jesus answered her gently, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed." What compassionate words. Jesus was not rejecting her effort. He was revealing her exhaustion. Because busyness can slowly consume the soul, especially when people believe their value depends on constant performance. Many people today live exactly like Martha, always rushing, always producing, always multitasking, always emotionally stretched thin. The world rewards constant activity, but the soul was never designed to live without stillness, and eventually, without rest. People begin breaking internally. Anxiety increases, peace disappears, joy fades, the heart becomes tired. But Mary chose something different. Stillness, presence, listening, resting near Jesus instead of endlessly striving. And perhaps tonight, Jesus is inviting some weary souls into that same stillness. Not into laziness, not into giving up, but into spiritual rest. Into the freedom of no longer carrying life alone. Because one of the greatest lies exhaustion tells people is this: everything depends on you. But it does not. You are human. Human. Limited. Fragile sometimes. And Jesus never expected human beings to carry infinite pressure. That is why he says, "Take my yoke upon you. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." Imagine hearing those words after years of emotional exhaustion, after years of pressure, after years of trying to survive. Because Jesus never intended faith to become another unbearable burden. His presence lifts burdens. Yet many people secretly live as though God is constantly disappointed in them, constantly demanding more, constantly angry, constantly impossible to please. But that is not the heart of Jesus. The heart of Jesus is gentle, patient, compassionate, especially toward weary people. That is why broken people felt safe around him. That is why exhausted souls moved toward him instead of away from him. Because something about his presence brought relief. Safety, peace, and perhaps that is exactly what your soul longs for tonight. Relief from pressure. Relief from constantly carrying emotional weight alone. Sometimes people become so used to stress. Sometimes people know how to relax to stress. They no longer know how to relax emotionally. Even during quiet moments, their thoughts keep worrying. Their minds keep preparing for disaster. And eventually, rest itself begins feeling unfamiliar. But Jesus still invites anxious hearts to slow down, to breathe, to remain near Him. There is something deeply healing about realizing you do not have to prove your worth to God. You do not have to earn rest. You do not have to perform perfectly before approaching Jesus. You can come weary. You can come emotionally drained. You can come carrying questions. And He still welcomes you. Again and again. Because His love does not disappear when people become tired. In fact, He often draws especially close to exhausted souls. Some people listening tonight have been fighting hidden emotional battles for years, battles nobody fully understands. Silent sadness, silent anxiety, silent disappointment. And over time, that hidden exhaustion begins affecting everything. Hope becomes harder. Faith becomes harder. Even prayer becomes difficult. But Jesus understands weakness better than most people realize. He understands trembling, faith. He understands emotional fatigue. He understands the long seasons of pain. He understands people carry after long seasons of pain. That is why His words continue calming weary hearts across generations, because they speak directly to exhausted humanity. Not with shame, but with compassion. And maybe tonight, your soul simply needs permission to stop striving for a moment, to stop carrying everything alone, to stop trying to control every outcome, to simply rest in the presence of God. Not because every problem has disappeared, but because Jesus remains near, even in difficult seasons, near to weary mothers, near to anxious fathers, near to lonely hearts, near to people silently fighting depression, near to people carrying invisible pain, near to souls. The holiest thing a person can do is simply rest in God's presence. He sometimes is simply rest in strong health, without hiding exhaustion, without performing, just resting, just breathing, just allowing the heart to become still again. And maybe tonight, Jesus is gently speaking peace over your exhausted soul, not demanding perfection, not increasing pressure, simply inviting you closer, closer to rest, closer to peace, closer to the kind of stillness the world cannot give. So if your heart feels tired tonight, stay here a little longer. Breathe slowly. Release the pressure, little by little. And remember this: Jesus has never turned away weary souls seeking rest. Never. And He will not begin with you. Some storms arrive suddenly, without warning, without preparation. One moment life feels stable, and the next moment everything begins shaking. A phone call changes everything. A diagnosis changes everything. A loss changes everything. And suddenly, The future feels uncertain. Fear enters the mind quickly during storms, very quickly, because storms make human beings feel small, fragile, powerless. And perhaps, tonight, someone listening feels trapped inside a storm right now. A storm of anxiety, a storm of grief, a storm of uncertainty, a storm of emotional exhaustion. And maybe part of you keeps asking the same question the disciples once asked. God, where are you in all of this? The disciples knew that feeling well. There was a night when they crossed the sea with Jesus. At first, everything seemed normal. The waves were manageable. The wind was calm, but storms on that sea could appear without warning. And suddenly, dark clouds gathered. The wind became violent. The water crashed against the boat. Fear spread quickly among the disciples. Experienced, fishermen panicked, because some storms become so overwhelming that human strength no longer feels enough. And maybe some people listening understand that feeling deeply, the feeling of trying your best and still feeling afraid, trying to stay strong and still feeling overwhelmed, trying to trust God while secretly wondering if things will ever improve. The disciples fought against the storm desperately. The boat filled with water. The wind grew louder. The fear became unbearable. And then they noticed something shocking. Jesus was asleep, sleeping peacefully in the middle of chaos. Imagine that scene. Waves crashing. The disciples terrified. And Jesus does not depend on the absence of storms, because peace does not depend on the absence of storms. It depends on who is present within them. But fear clouded the disciples' hearts. They woke him and cried out, "Lord, save us! We're going to drown." And perhaps tonight some hearts are crying similar prayers. Lord, I cannot handle this anymore. Lord, I feel overwhelmed. Lord, I feel afraid. Lord, please help me. And Jesus answered with words both gentle and powerful. Why are you afraid? You of little faith. Notice something important. Jesus did not shame them for feeling fear. He invited them into trust beyond fear. Because faith is not the absence of emotion. Faith is choosing to believe God remains present, even while emotions feel unstable. Then Jesus stood, and with complete authority, he spoke to the storm. Ask it some. The wind stopped. The waves calmed. The sea became still. And suddenly, peace replaced chaos. Can you imagine the silence after that storm? The stillness, the relief, the awe. Because when Jesus speaks peace, even creation responds. And perhaps this story matters so deeply because life overwhelming, uncontrollable. Sometimes people feel like they are drowning emotionally, drowning in pressure, drowning in grief, drowning in fear about the future, drowning in exhaustion. And the hardest part about storms is that they often make people feel abandoned, forgotten, alone. But the disciples were never alone in the boat, even while terrified, even while doubting, even while panicking. Jesus was still with them. And perhaps tonight you are not as alone as fear, hopelessness. Fear always exaggerates hopelessness. It convinces people. The storm will last forever. But storms do not have final authority over your life. God does, and sometimes. Faith means holding on to that truth, means holding on even when emotions struggle to believe it. There was another moment when the disciples found themselves battling waves during the night. The wind was against them. The sea was rough. And then, through the darkness, they saw someone walking on the water. At first, they thought it was a ghost. Fear overwhelmed them. But then, Jesus spoke words that still calm fearful hearts today. Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. What incredible words! Because Jesus often approaches people in the middle of storms, not after them, in the middle. Not after fear disappears, not after life becomes certainty. Right in the middle of uncertainty, Peter heard the voice of Jesus and answered, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you on the water." And Jesus simply said, "Come." Peter stepped out of the boat, into wind, into waves, into uncertainty. But for a moment, he actually walked above the storm. Not because Peter was powerful, but because his eyes is something deeply important on Jesus. And because people often sink emotionally when fear becomes bigger than faith, when circumstances become louder than God's presence, when circumstances become louder than God's presence, when storms consume all attention. Peter walked until he focused more on the wind than on Christ. And the moment fear took over completely, he began to sink. Maybe some people listening tonight understand that feeling too. The feeling of slowly sinking emotionally, sinking into exhaustions, sinking cried out. And Peter cried out desperately, "Lord, save me." Such a short prayer, but sometimes the deepest prayers are the simplest ones. And immediately, Jesus reached out his hand. Immediately, not eventually, not after Peter proved himself worthy. Immediately, because Jesus responds quickly to desperate hearts reaching toward him. And perhaps tonight, someone desperately needs to remember that. You are not drowning unseen. You are not sinking unnoticed. Even now, Jesus sees the storm surrounding you, the storm inside your thoughts, the storm inside your emotions, the storm inside your heart, still reaches toward struggling people, still reaches toward fearful people, still reaches toward exhausted souls, trying to survive difficult seasons, trying to survive. Some storms in life end quickly, others last much longer. But one truth remains constant through every season. Jesus does not abandon his people in the storm, even when emotions feel unstable, even when fear feels overwhelming, even when faith feels weak. He remains present, and sometimes that presence becomes the very thing carrying people through darkness they never thought they could survive. Faith does not mean pretending. Storms are easy. Faith means believing Jesus remains greater than the storm itself, greater than fear, greater than anxiety, greater than uncertainty, greater than the chaos trying to consume your peace. And maybe tonight, your soul needs to hear those words again. Do not be afraid. Not because life is perfect, not because pain is absent, but because Jesus still walks upon waves, still calms storms, still reaches for sinking people, still speaks peace into fearful hearts. So if you feel overwhelmed tonight, breathe slowly. The storm may feel loud right now, but the of Jesus is still stronger. But the voice of Jesus is still stronger, and even in fear, even in uncertainty, even in fear, he remains in the boat with you. Loneliness can become very quiet, so quiet that eventually nobody notices it anymore. Some people are surrounded by others every day and still feel completely alone inside. They laugh in conversations, they answer messages, they continue living normal routines, but deep within normal routines, there is an ache, a longing to feel truly known, truly safe, truly understood. And perhaps tonight, someone listening knows exactly what that loneliness feels like. The loneliness of carrying pain nobody sees. The loneliness of feeling emotionally distant from others. The loneliness of wondering whether anyone truly understands the battles happening inside your soul. Loneliness changes people slowly. It can make the world feel colder. It's heavier, more exhausting, especially when disappointment has already wounded the heart many times before. Some people stop opening up because trust became painful. Some stop asking for help because they fear becoming a burden. Others silently convince themselves no one would understand anyway. And over time, the heart begins building walls. Walls meant to protect pain. But those same walls often trap people inside isolation. Yet throughout the Gospels, Jesus consistently moved toward lonely people, toward outcasts, toward people society overlooked, because the heart of Christ has always been drawn toward the wounded. There was a moment when Jesus described images in all of Scripture, using one of the most comforting images in all. He said, "I am the good shepherd." What a gentle image. Not a distant ruler, not a cold authority, a shepherd, someone who walks beside the sheep, protects them, guides them, stays with them. And perhaps that image matters deeply, because sheep are vulnerable creatures. They struggle, frightened, easily. They struggle surviving alone, and in many ways, human beings are not very different. People wander emotionally, spiritually, mentally, especially during painful seasons. Fear confuses people. pain, loneliness, confuses people, and sometimes the soul no longer knows where safety exists. But Jesus said something beautiful about the shepherd. He calls his own sheep by name, not as numbers, not as statistics, personally, intimately, because Jesus does not love people generically. He knows them deeply, completely. He knows your fears, your personality, your memories, your struggles, the wounds you rarely talk about, the battles nobody else notices, even the tears you hide from others. Nothing about your life is invisible to him. And perhaps tonight, someone desperately needs to hear that. You are not forgotten by God, not overlooked, not abandoned, not emotionally invisible. The Good Shepherd still knows his sheep by name, still remains near to people struggling in darkness. Jesus continued saying, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me." There are many voices in this world. Voices of fear, voices of shame, voices of comparison, voices of anxiety, voices constantly telling people they are not enough, not successful enough, not attractive enough, not important enough, not worthy enough. And over time, those voices can become exhausting, especially for wounded hearts. But the voice of Jesus sounds different. His voice does not crush the soul. It restores it. His voice does not fill people with hopelessness. It brings peace. Even correction from Jesus carries compassion, because his goal is always restoration, never destruction. There are moments in life when people begin feeling spiritually lost. They functioning outwardly, lost, but inwardly, they feel disconnected, empty, far from God. And maybe some listeners understand that feeling tonight. You still believe, but something inside feels tired, distant, dry, like your soul has been wandering for a very long time. But one of the most beautiful truths about the Good Shepherd is that he searches for wandering sheep who left 90 easily give up on them. Jesus once spoke about a shepherd behind to search for one that was lost. One sheep, one wandering soul, one broken life, because that single sheep mattered deeply to the shepherd. And perhaps tonight, you feel like that wandering sheep, tired, confused, spiritually exhausted. But Jesus still searches for weary souls, still calls people home, still moves toward home, still moves toward the lost with compassion, not disgust, compassion. The enemy wants people to believe they are too far gone, too broken, too sinful, too spiritually weak. But Jesus specializes in restoring wandering hearts. That is what he has always done, again and again. Some people listening tonight have been hurt by people they trusted, hurt by betrayal, hurt by rejection, hurt by abandonment, and pain like that often creates fear. Fear of trusting again, fear of becoming vulnerable again. But Jesus described himself differently from hired shepherds. He said, "The hired hand runs away when danger comes, but the good shepherd stays, even when wolves appear, even when sacrifice becomes necessary, even when the cost becomes painful." And then Jesus said something extraordinary. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. This is the heart of Christ. Sacrificial love, faithful love, protective love. Not temporary affection, not conditional care. Love willing to suffer for others. Love willing to remain. Because Jesus never loved people from a safe emotional distance. He entered human pain himself. He walked through grief, rejection, betrayal, suffering, loneliness. And because of that, he understands wounded hearts more deeply than anyone else ever could. Some people listening tonight feel emotionally abandoned. Maybe by family, maybe by friends, maybe by people they trusted deeply. And abandonment leaves scars. It creates deep fears inside the soul. Fears of being unwanted, fears of not mattering, fears that everyone eventually leaves. But Jesus speaks directly against that fear. He said, "I will never leave you, nor forsake you." What incredible comfort, especially for lonely hearts, especially who feel forgotten by the world, because the presence of Jesus does not disappear in difficult seasons. Asazes during difficult, if anything. He often draws even closer to broken people then, closer to grieving hearts, closer to anxious minds, closer to lonely souls, struggling quietly in darkness. And maybe tonight, you need to stop listening to the voice saying you are alone, because you are not, even now. The Good Shepherd remains near, watching, guiding, protecting, comforting. Some people expect God to speak only through dramatic miracles, but often His presence arrives quietly, like peace slowly returning to the heart, like strength appearing one more day, like comfort during sleepless nights, like hope refusing to fully die. And perhaps the shepherd has been walking beside you, even in seasons where you felt abandoned, even in moments when you questioned everything, even when fear became overwhelming. He remained, because the faithfulness of Jesus does not depend on human perfection. It depends on His character, and His character never changes. He is still the shepherd who searches for lost sheep, still the shepherd who protects wounded hearts during dark nights, still the shepherd who stays beside weary souls during dark nights. So if loneliness has been weighing heavily on your heart lately, listen carefully tonight. The voice of Jesus still calls your name with love, still calls you closer, still reminds you that you are seen, known, protected, and deeply loved by the shepherd who never abandons his sheep. So rest for a moment. Breathe slowly. You do not walk through this darkness alone. The shepherd is still near, and he is still leading weary souls safely home. There are wounds, that people try to hide from everyone. Private failures, private regrets, private memories that still ache years later. And perhaps one of the heaviest burdens a human soul can carry is guilt, because guilt follows people quietly into their thoughts, into their relationships. Some people spend years into sleepless nights, into prayer. Some people spend years replaying moments they wish they could undo. Inside, words they wish they never spoke, choices they wish they never made, people they hurt, people they lost. And over time, shame begins changing the way people see themselves. They no longer see someone worthy of love. Only failure, only weakness, only disappointment. And maybe tonight, someone listening has been carrying that kind of guilt for a very long time. The kind nobody else fully knows about. The kind hidden beneath normal conversations and daily routines. But Jesus always moved differently towards sinners than religion expected. Others condemned. Jesus restored. Others rejected. Jesus drew near. Others saw ruined people. Jesus saw souls worth saving. There was a man in Scripture known for failure, Peter. Strong, passionate, loyal. At least he believed. He was when Jesus warned the disciples that difficult hours were coming. Peter immediately promised unwavering faithfulness. Even if everyone else falls away, I never will. But Jesus already knew. Fear would overwhelm Peter later that night, and gently. Jesus told him before the rooster crows, "You will deny me 3 times." Imagine hearing those words. Peter could not believe it. How could someone who loved Jesus deny him? But human weakness often appears in moments people least expect, especially during fear, especially during pressure. And perhaps some people listening tonight to fail know exactly what it feels like in ways they never imagined, to become someone they never thought they would become. Fear can make people do painful things. Exhaustion can weaken people. Pressure can expose hidden weakness inside the human heart. Later that night, Jesus was arrested. The atmosphere became dangerous, chaotic. Fear spread quickly. The disciples scattered, and Peter followed from a distance, still watching, still conflicted, still afraid. Then someone recognized him. "You were with Jesus too." Peter panicked, and he denied it again and again and again, 3 times exactly as Jesus had said. And then the rooster crowed. Imagine that moment. The sudden silence, the realization, the crushing weight of failure flooding. Scripture says Peter went outside, cycled and wept bitterly. Not small tears. Deep grief. Because guilt breaks something inside people, especially when they know they failed someone they love. And perhaps tonight, someone listening understands that pain deeply. The pain of disappointing others. The pain of disappointing yourself. The pain of knowing, spiritually, ashamed. the pain of knowing you failed in moments that mattered. Some people carry hidden shame for years, and eventually that shame becomes an identity. Not, I made mistakes, but I am a mistake. And that is one of the cruelest lies. Shame tells the human heart because Jesus never defined people by their worst moment. Never if he did. Peter's story would have ended in failure. But Jesus specializes in restoring broken people. After the resurrection, Jesus sought Peter out again. Think about that. Peter failed publicly, denied Christ openly, collapsed under fear, and Jesus still came back for him, not to humiliate him, not to destroy him, to restore him. One morning after the resurrection, Jesus stood beside a fire while the disciples gathered nearby, and then he asked Peter a question. Do you love me? Not once, 3 times. Almost like Jesus was gently healing every denial with grace. Peter answered through pain, Lord, you know that I love you. And each time, Jesus responded with purpose. Feed my sheep, what mercy, what compassion. Jesus did not discard Peter after failure. He rebuilt him more than you realize. That truth matters more than you realize, because many people secretly believe failure permanently separates them from God, that after enough mistakes, God eventually gives up on them. But the gospel tells a different story. A story of mercy, a story of restoration, a story of grace, reaching wounded people again and again. Jesus once told a story about 2 men praying in accomplishments. One man proudly listed all his religious accomplishments, the Qum, all his good deeds, all the reasons he believed himself righteous. But the other man stood far away quietly, ashamed, broken, unable even to lift his eyes toward heaven, and he simply prayed, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Such a simple prayer. And yet Jesus said, that broken man went home justified before God. Why? Because humility opens the heart to mercy. Some people never experience grace deeply because pride keeps them distant from it. But broken people understand their need for mercy. And perhaps tonight, your wounds may actually be bringing you closer to God than you realize. Because people who know their need for grace often treasure Jesus more deeply. The truth is, every human being needs mercy. Every person has failed. Every person carries weakness. Every person falls short somehow. That is why Jesus came. Not for perfect people, for sinners, for wounded souls, for broken hearts, for people drowning in shame. Some listeners tonight may feel spiritually exhausted because guilt has consumed their thoughts for years. You replay the past constantly. You replay the past constantly. You punish yourself mentally. You wonder if forgiveness is even possible anymore. But listen carefully. Jesus did not go to the cross for perfect people. He went for broken people, for fearful people, for guilty people, for people who desperately needed mercy. The cross is proof that God's love reaches deeper than human failure, deeper than shame, deeper than regret. You fight deeper than your worst mistakes. Some people think forgiveness means pretending sin never mattered, but true forgiveness cost Jesus everything. Love carried him to the cross willingly. Love opened the door for sinners to come home again. Love opened the door for sinners to come home again. And perhaps tonight, Jesus is inviting some weary hearts to stop carrying shame alone, to stop hiding, to stop believing they are beyond redemption. Because grace still exists, mercy still exists, restoration still exists. The enemy wants people trapped in condemnation forever. Jesus offers freedom instead. Not freedom through denial, freedom through forgiveness. Some scars remain painful. Some consequences remain difficult. But grace can still rebuild a life. Peter became one of the boldest voices of faith after being restored. Not because he was naturally strong, but because he personally experienced mercy. And people who truly experience mercy often become the most compassionate souls. Perhaps your story is not the final either. Perhaps failure is not the final chapter. Perhaps grace is still writing something beautiful through your brokenness. So if guilt has been crushing your heart lately, bring it honestly before Jesus. Do not hide. Do not pretend. Do not run away in shame, because Christ already knows every failure and still offers mercy, still offers restoration. The same Jesus who restored Peter still restores wounded people today, still lifts ashamed hearts, still speaks peace over guilty souls. Are you, and perhaps tonight, His mercy is reaching toward you too, not with condemnation, but with open hands, inviting weary sinners to come home again. There are seasons when the world feels heavy, dark, confusing, almost overwhelming to the soul. People look around and see division everywhere, fear everywhere. Violence, hatred, confusion, endless noise. And sometimes it becomes difficult not to feel emotionally drained by it all. Many people secretly carry a deep fear about the future, fear about where the world is heading, fear about what tomorrow may bring, fear that darkness is growing stronger, and perhaps tonight, someone listening has felt that fear recently. The feeling that everything around you feels unstable. Morality changing. Truth becoming harder to recognize. People becoming colder, more disconnected, more angry. And quietly, the heart begins asking difficult questions. What is happening to the world? Why does everything feel so broken? Will things ever get better? Even during the time of Jesus, people carried fears about the future, fear of destruction, fear of suffering, fear of uncertainty. And Jesus spoke honestly about difficult days did not exist. He never pretended darkness. He never ignored human suffering. But he also never allowed fear to have the final word. There was a moment when the disciples asked Jesus about the future, about the end of the age, about signs of difficult times ahead. And Jesus described a world filled with turmoil, wars, rumors of wars, natural disasters, confusion, false prophets, deceiving many. And because of increasing wickedness, the love of many growing cold. What heartbreaking words! Because perhaps one of the saddest realities of darkness is not simply suffering itself, but hearts becoming cold. People losing compassion, losing tenderness, losing hope. And maybe some listeners understand that feeling tonight. The feeling of becoming emotionally numb after seeing too much pain. Too much disappointment, too much chaos. Sometimes darkness slowly exhausts the soul. People stop believing goodness still exists. Stop believing peace is possible. Stop believing love can survive in such a broken world. But Jesus warned his followers about fear for an important reason. So they would remain awake spiritually. Not consumed by panic. Awake. There is a difference. Fear paralyzes people, but spiritual awareness prepares them without destroying their peace. Jesus said, "See to it that you are not troubled." What incredible words! Because even while describing difficult times, he still called people toward peace instead of panic. The world constantly feeds fear. Fear spreads quickly through headlines, through social media, through endless noise and outrage, and over time, many hearts become spiritually exhausted from carrying constant anxiety about the future. But Jesus never called his people to live controlled by fear. He called them to remain faithful in darkness, to continue loving, continue trusting, to continue loving, continue walking in truth, even when the world feels unstable. And perhaps tonight, that message matters deeply, because darkness often tempts people toward hopelessness. It whispers, everything is falling apart. There is no future. There is no light left. But darkness has always existed in the human story. And still, God has continued working through generations, still healing, still restoring, still drawing souls toward himself. Jesus once described the path to life as narrow, a narrow gate, a difficult road. Not because God delights in difficulty, but because truth has never followed the crowd easily. And perhaps one of the hardest things in dark times is remaining spiritually grounded, while so many voices compete for attention. Voices promising happiness without truth. Voices encouraging selfishness. Voices celebrating emptiness while calling it freedom. And many souls become lost trying to follow every voice except the voice of God. But Jesus continued, reminding people that his kingdom operates differently from the kingdoms of this world. His kingdom is built on truth, mercy, humility, compassion, faithfulness. Even in darkness, especially in darkness. Some people listening tonight feel exhausted because the world constantly pulls at their peace. Constant negativity, constant temptation, constant distraction, constant pressure, and eventually the heart becomes tired, not simply physically, spiritually. Jesus understood this struggle. That is why he often withdrew into quiet places to pray, to reconnect with the Father, to rest in stillness away from the noise, because the soul cannot remain healthy while constantly drowning in chaos. And perhaps tonight, your spirit desperately needs quiet again. Not more noise, not more fear, not more noise, not more fear, not more endless healing about the world. Truth, the presence of God. There is something deeply sealed from the fear-driven rhythm of the world. Not about remembering that God's authority remains greater than human chaos, greater than corruption, greater than darkness itself. Sometimes people become so focused on everything going wrong, they stop noticing signs of grace still surrounding them. Acts of kindness, moments of mercy, unexpected peace, quiet reminders that God is still present, even in difficult times. The enemy wants people consumed by despair, because hopeless people often stop fighting spiritually, stop praying, stop believing, stop trusting. But Jesus repeatedly reminded his followers to endure, to remain faithful, to keep their lamps burning even in dark nights. And perhaps tonight, that is exactly what your soul needs. Not panic, not despair, endurance. Quiet faithfulness, steady trust, even when answers feel unclear. Jesus once called himself the light of the world. What beautiful words, because light matters most in darkness. But true light can feel calm when life is easy, and perhaps that is why so many exhausted become difficult. And perhaps that is why toward Jesus, generation after generation, Jewish generation. Because something about his presence brings light into heavy places inside the soul. Light into fear. Light into confusion. Light into grief. Light into loneliness. Some people listening tonight feel emotionally overwhelmed by the condition of the world. Maybe you feel spiritually weary, watching hatred increase. Maybe you feel discouraged by constant division. Maybe you fear what future generations may face. But remember this carefully. Darkness has never overcome Christ. Never. Empires rise and fall. Cultures change. Human history shifts constantly. Steady, faithful, unshaken. And his kingdom cannot be destroyed by human darkness. That does not mean suffering disappears overnight, but it does mean darkness never has final authority. Hope still exists, grace still exists, truth still exists, and the light of Christ still shines in places that feel hopeless. Even now, even tonight. Perhaps your heart has grown tired from carrying fear about the future. If so, rest for a moment. Breathe slowly. You do not need to carry the weight of the entire world on your shoulders. You do not need to carry. God is still present, still sovereign, still guiding history. Even when human eyes struggle to understand everything happening, and perhaps the invitation tonight is simple. Stay close to Jesus, closer than before, closer than the fear, closer than the darkness, trying to consume your peace. Because storms may increase, the world may feel uncertain, but the light of Christ still shines through darkness. And darkness has never been strong enough to extinguish it. There are moments in life when hope seems to disappear completely. Moments when the darkness feels too heavy, too final, too painful to survive. And perhaps nothing in human history ever felt darker than the final hours before the crucifixion of Jesus. The disciples had left everything to follow him. They believed he was the Messiah, the Savior, the one who would change everything. They watched him heal the sick, restore the broken, calm storms, raise the dead, speak with authority unlike anyone they had ever known, and yet, now everything seemed to be collapsing. Betrayal had entered the story. Judas arrived in the night. A kiss became the sign of betrayal. Soldiers surrounded Jesus. Fear spread quickly through the disciples. Confusion overwhelmed them. Because suffering often confuses human hearts, especially when people do not understand why God allows painful things to happen. And perhaps tonight, some listeners know exactly what it feels like when life suddenly stops making answered, when loss arrives unexpectedly, when darkness enters without warning. The disciples watched as Jesus was arrested, mocked, beaten, humiliated, and slowly, their hope began falling apart. Peter denied him. Others fled. Fear consumed them all, because human strength collapses quickly when suffering becomes overwhelming. Jesus stood before crowds filled with anger. The same crowds that once shouted with excitement, shouted for crucifixion, now shouted for crucifixion. How quickly human approval changes. How fragile worldly acceptance truly is. And perhaps some hearts listening tonight have also experienced rejection, abandonment, betrayal from people once trusted deeply. Jesus understands that pain. He understands what it feels like to be abandoned by friends, mocked, misunderstood. The soldiers placed a crown of thorns upon his head, not a crown of honor, a crown of suffering. Blood flowed down his face, the creator of humanity, allowing himself to endure cruelty from the people he came to save. What kind of love does that? What kind of mercy willingly suffers for others? Only divine love, only the love of Christ. Jesus, in hatred and mocking streets, filled with hatred and mocking voices. Step after painful step, his body weakened, his breathing heavy, and yet he continued walking toward the very suffering that would save humanity. It was the cross, choosing sacrifice. And perhaps tonight, some people need to remember how deeply they are loved by God, not through empty words, but through the suffering Jesus willingly endured. Every wound carried purpose. Every moment of agony carried redemption. Eventually, they nailed him to the cross. Hands pierced, feet pierced, the Son of God hanging between heaven and earth. And even then, Jesus continued speaking. Mercy, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. What astonishing compassion. Most human beings respond to pain with anger, bitterness, revenge. But Jesus responded with forgiveness. Even while suffering, even while bleeding, even while dying. And perhaps that reveals something beautiful about the heart of Christ. His mercy reaches further than human cruelty, further than hatred, further than sin itself. Bitterness. Darkness covered the land. The sky itself seemed to mourn, and the disciples watched their world collapse completely. The one they trusted appeared defeated, silent, broken upon a cross. Some people listening tonight understand what it feels like when hope seems buried, when dreams die, when grief feels unbearable, when life becomes painfully quiet after loss. Jesus cried out, "My God, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What heartbreaking words, because Jesus fully entered human suffering, not partially. Fully, he entered grief, agony, loneliness, abandonment, pain beyond human imagination. And because of that, he understands wounded humanity completely. There is no sorrow he cannot understand, no grief he cannot recognize, no darkness unfamiliar to him. Eventually, Jesus spoke his final words. "It is finished," and then silence. The earth shook. The curtain in the temple tore apart. Creation itself responded to the death of Christ. And suddenly, everything felt empty. The disciples hid in fear. The crowds disappeared. The cross stood silently beneath a darkened sky, and Jesus was placed inside a tomb. A stone rolled across the entrance. Final, cold, still, for many followers. It must have felt like darkness had won. Perhaps some listeners tonight understand seasons that feel exactly like that tomb. Seasons where prayers seem buried. Seasons where prayers seem buried. Hope seems buried. Joy seems buried. Where life feels silent and heavy. And maybe you wonder whether restoration is even possible anymore. But the beautiful truth of the gospel is this. The tomb was never the end of the story. Darkness believed it had won. Death believed it had authority. Fear believed hope was gone forever. But heaven was not finished, and perhaps tonight, God is not finished with your story either. Not even in painful seasons. Not even after devastating loss. Not even after failure. Because resurrection often begins in places that appear hopeless. On the third day, something extraordinary happened. The stone was rolled away, not because Jesus needed help escaping, but because humanity needed to witness the miracle. The tomb was empty. Death could not hold him. The grave could not silence him. Darkness could not defeat him. Jesus rose again, alive, victorious, eternal. Can you imagine the overwhelming emotion of that moment? The shock, the wonder, the impossible becoming reality, the realization that hope itself had risen from the grave. And perhaps that is why the resurrection still moves human hearts so deeply, because it speaks directly into hopelessness. It reminds suffering people that darkness never has final authority. It reminds grieving hearts that death itself is not the end. It reminds weary souls that death itself. It reminds wearing's life out of impossible situations. Mary Magdalene arrived at the tomb weeping, broken with grief, and through her tears she saw Jesus standing there alive. At first, she did not recognize him. Grief can blind people sometimes. Pain can make hope difficult to see. But then Jesus spoke her name, Mary, one word, and suddenly she recognized him, because the voice of Jesus still reaches broken hearts personally, still calls wounded souls by name, still brings hope into places filled with sorrow. The disciples saw him alive too. The same Jesus who had been crucified, the same Jesus who suffered, now standing before them victorious over death itself. And their fear slowly transformed into hope. Their despair transformed into faith. Their grief transformed into joy. Because resurrection changes everything. Some people listening tonight feel trapped inside emotional tombs. Tombs of fear, tombs of anxiety, tombs of grief, tombs of exhaustion. And perhaps you secretly wonder whether peace can ever return again. But the resurrection reminds humanity of something powerful. God still brings life into dead places, still restores what seems impossible, still speaks hope into darkness. The wounds of Jesus remained visible after the resurrection. Notice that carefully. The scars remained, but they no longer represented defeat. They represented victory. And perhaps your wounds may one day tell a story of survival too. Not because pain was easy, but because God carried you through it. The resurrection does not erase human suffering, but it transforms the meaning of suffering forever. Because now darkness is temporary. Death is temporary. Grief is temporary. Grief is temporary. Fear is temporary. And perhaps tonight, the victory of Christ is eternal. And perhaps tonight, your weary soul needs to rest in that hope. Not shallow optimism, the risen Christ. Real hope, the kind anchored in the risen Christ. The kind that survives painful seasons. The kind that remains steady even during uncertainty. Jesus conquered the grave, and because he lives, hope still lives too. Mercy still lives. Peace still lives. Grace still lives. And perhaps the same God who raised Christ from the dead is still breathing life into exhausted souls tonight, still restoring hearts, still healing wounds, still lifting people out of darkness, little by little. So if your heart feels heavy tonight, do not lose hope. The tomb was not the end, and your story is not over either, because resurrection is what Jesus does. He brings life into hopeless places, light into darkness, peace into fearful hearts. And even now, the risen Savior still stands beside weary souls, speaking hope into the darkest nights of human life. Tonight, the world can wait for a little while. The pressure, the noise, the expectations, the fears about tomorrow. Let them grow quiet for a moment. Just breathe. Slowly. You have carried enough today, perhaps more than most people realize. And now, your soul is tired, not weak, not thinking too much. Tired, not worthless, simply tired. Tired from worrying too much. Tired from carrying emotional weight nobody else can fully see. And maybe tonight, Jesus is gently inviting you to rest, not perform, not strive, not pretend, just rest. Like a weary child finally safe in the arms of a loving Father. There is something deeply healing about remembering. You do not have to solve every future problem alone. You do not have to solve every future problem tonight. You do not have to keep replaying every painful memory. You do not have to keep punishing yourself for things already buried beneath the mercy of God. Tonight, you are allowed to breathe again. Slowly, quietly, peacefully. The shepherd is still watching over his sheep, even now. Perhaps your heart still feels heavy. Perhaps unanswered questions still remain. Perhaps certain wounds still ache deeply. But healing often begins softly, quietly, like the first light appearing before sunrise. Like calm returning after violent waves. Little by little, moment by moment. And maybe tonight, your exhausted soul simply needs stillness more than answers. Stillness in the presence of Jesus. The same Jesus who comforted the broken. The same Jesus who calmed storms. The same Jesus who restored sinners. The same Jesus who conquered death itself. He remains near, still gentle, still merciful, still compassionate toward weary hearts. Some people, listening tonight, feel emotionally overwhelmed by life, overwhelmed by pressure, overwhelmed by grief, overwhelmed by loneliness, overwhelmed by fear about the future. And perhaps you have spent so long surviving that you no longer remember what deep peace feels like. But the presence of God still reaches tired souls, still calms anxious minds, still strengthens weak hearts. Even in quiet moments like this, you do not need perfect faith tonight. Only openness, only honesty, only the willingness to rest for a moment in the love of Christ. Because Jesus has never rejected weary people who came to him sincerely. Never. Not the fearful, not the ashamed, not the anxious, not the exhausted. And perhaps that truth matters deeply tonight, because some people secretly believe they must become stronger before approaching God, cleaner before approaching God, before approaching God. But Jesus always welcomed broken people first. Always. He still does, even now, even tonight. Maybe your thoughts have been racing for hours. Maybe sleep has become difficult lately. Maybe fear keeps replaying worst-case scenarios inside your mind. But listen carefully. You are safe in the hands of God. The future is not outside his control. Your life is not forgotten. Your tears are not ignored. Your prayers are not wasted. Even the silent prayers spoken only inside the heart are heard by him. There are moments when the soul becomes tired of carrying fear, tired of carrying sadness, tired of carrying disappointment. And perhaps tonight, Jesus is whispering softly to your heart. You do not have to carry this alone anymore. You do not have to carry this alone anymore. What beautiful mercy. Because humanity was never designed to survive, separated from God. The soul longs for him. Even when people do not fully understand that longing, that deep ache for peace, that deep ache for rest, that deep ache to finally feel safe. Only the presence of God reaches that deeply into the human heart. And maybe that is why your spirit feels calmer right now. Not because every problem disappeared, but because peace often begins with presence. The presence of Christ near weary souls, near anxious hearts, near people silently fighting emotional battles. Perhaps there are wounds inside you that still need healing, old disappointments, and maybe part of your heart, old betrayals, still struggles to trust fully again. But Jesus remains patient with wounded people, patient with fearful people, patient with people slowly learning how to rest again. Healing is often gradual, slow, gentle, like tired eyes finally closing, like tense muscles finally relaxing, like frightened hearts finally relaxing, and perhaps tonight, your soul is beginning to exhale burdens it carried for too long. For too long. The burden of trying to control everything. The burden of pretending to be okay. The burden of fear. The burden of shame. The burden of loneliness. Jesus still says, "Come to me," still, after all these generations, after all human pain, his invitation remains open. Some people listening tonight feel emotionally isolated, like nobody fully understands the depth of their struggles. But Jesus understands completely. He understands grief. He understands betrayal. He understands exhaustion. He understands sleepless nights. People hide from everyone else. And because he understands, His comfort reaches deeper than human comfort ever could. The world offers temporary escape, temporary distraction, temporary numbness. But the peace of Christ reaches the soul itself, the hidden places, the wounded places, the frightened places. And perhaps tonight, His peace is slowly reaching those places inside you too. You do not need to fear tomorrow right now. Tonight is simply about resting, breathing, allowing your soul to become still again. The same God who carried you through every difficult season before this one is still carrying you tonight, even if you cannot fully see it yet. Even if your emotions still feel fragile, even if your faith feels tired, He remains faithful, always. The shepherd still watches through the night, still comforts weary hearts, still walks beside lonely souls, and perhaps right now, you are being held more gently than you realize. There is no pressure here, no performance, no need to prove anything. Only rest, only grace, only the quiet presence of Jesus surrounding tired souls in the darkness. Maybe tonight, you can finally stop fighting every thought, stop trying to solve every fear, stop carrying every burden alone, and simply let yourself rest in the love of God. Not perfect rest, not complete healing overnight. Just rest for this moment. One breath at a time, one quiet prayer at a time, one peaceful moment at a time, because sometimes that is how restoration begins, quietly, slowly, deep within the soul. And perhaps, while you listen tonight, something inside your heart is becoming lighter. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because Jesus is near. Near enough to comfort, near enough to strengthen, near enough to calm fear, little by little. The night may still feel dark sometimes, but darkness is never empty when Christ is present. Never His peace still fills quiet rooms, still reaches anxious minds, still comforts people lying awake at night, wondering if everything will be okay. And perhaps tonight, He is comforting you too. Maybe tomorrow still feels uncertain. Maybe challenges still remain. But for now, rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts quiet down little by little. You are not abandoned. The shepherd remains alone. You are not fighting. Is enough for this moment, and His presence is enough. Enough for tonight. Enough for the burdens you cannot carry by yourself anymore. Enough for the fears still trembling quietly inside your heart. Enough for the grief. Enough for the exhaustion. Enough for the silence. Because Jesus has always been enough for weary souls. Always. So close your eyes gently if you need to. Release the tension in your shoulders. Let the noise fade into the background. And remember this before sleep finally comes. The Savior who calmed storms still watches over you tonight. The shepherd who searched for lost sheep still walks beside you tonight. the Savior who forgave sinners, still extends mercy tonight. Death, the risen Christ who defeated death, still brings hope tonight. You are held in hands stronger than fear, stronger than darkness, stronger than grief, stronger than uncertainty. And even while you rest, God remains awake, still protecting, still guiding, still loving, still near. So, sleep in peace tonight, not because life is perfect, but because Jesus remains with you through every imperfect moment, and His love has never failed weary souls who rest in Him. Never. Not then, not now, not tonight, and not for all eternity.